And the war was fought almost exclusively on West German soil. Now, what was the end result? The end result is that 1.7 million Germans died, West Germans died, and 3.5 million West Germans were wounded. Moreover, these numbers don't take into account the subsequent deaths that would occur as a result of the radiation poisoning. So you just want to think about that. You had a war game that went from June 20th to June 28th. This is 1955, the middle of the 50s. And it ended up with 1.7 million West Germans dead. What does this tell you? In effect, it tells you that you're destroying Germany to save Germany.
大家好，这里是华人视角频道。刚才的精彩集锦已经把一个残酷事实摆在我们面前，号称用来保卫欧洲的战术核武器，最后却可能把欧洲本身变成战场。20世纪50年代那场 Carte Blanche 兵棋推演，假设只动用几百枚核武器，结果却是超过170万名西德人死亡，另有350万人受伤，而且还没有计算后续的辐射伤亡。所谓有限核战争，听起来像是精密可控的军事方案。推演结果却说明，一旦核武器被推上战场，谁也无法保证局势不会沿着升级阶梯一路失控。更值得警惕的是，今天美国常规军力和工业基础相对削弱，重新依赖战术核武器的声音又开始出现。历史已经给过答案，核武器也许能制造威胁，却无法真正赢得战争。本期节目，我们就从这场被遗忘的兵棋推演讲起，看看北约为何曾经迷信战术核武，又为何最终不得不改变战略。
And in fact, the Russians or the Soviets ended up using or deploying or exploding more nuclear weapons, slightly more nuclear weapons than NATO did. But let's say the total was about 335 nuclear weapons, and the war was fought almost exclusively on West German soil. Now, what was the end result? The end result is that 1.7 million Germans died, West Germans died, and 3.5 million West Germans were wounded. Moreover, these numbers don't take into account the subsequent deaths that would occur as a result of the radiation poisoning. So you just want to think about that. You had a war game that went from June 20th to June 28th. This is 1955, the middle of the 50s. And it ended up with 1.7 million West Germans dead. What does this tell you? In effect, it tells you that you're destroying Germany to save Germany. This operation, this war game, was viewed as evidence that it was hard to see how you could defend West Germany with tactical nuclear weapons without destroying it as a functioning country. And it raised all sorts of concerns, unsurprisingly, in West Germany about whether this was a viable strategy for defending Germany or defending Western Europe against a possible Soviet attack. When people calculated how much destruction had resulted from this war game, it became clear to many people that given this level of destruction, tactical nuclear weapons did not make much sense. There was another dimension that came into play here that really mattered, and that's the issue of escalation. In the war game itself, it became very clear that it was hard to control escalation. And there is no question that it's hard to draw a clear line between tactical nuclear weapons, intermediate range nuclear weapons, and strategic nuclear weapons. And not only is it hard to draw that line, it's a slippery slope, so that once you start using tactical nuclear weapons, you quickly find yourself in a situation where you're thinking about using intermediate range nuclear weapons or strategic nuclear weapons. On top of that, because we thankfully have never had a nuclear war, we have very little understanding of the dynamics of escalation in a nuclear war. And you want to understand that in a nuclear war, if you're interested in limiting it to West Germany, here we're talking about the NATO scenario, you need excellent command and control. And that's true in any nuclear war, right? If you want to keep it limited, you have to have excellent command and control systems. And there's just all sorts of evidence that it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to maintain meaningful command and control as you go up the escalation ladder in a nuclear conflict. So what happens after Carte Blanche is we come to realize that tactical nuclear weapons really are not a viable way of defending West Germany because of the destruction that would be wrought on that country. And furthermore, we come to quickly understand that the threat of escalation is so great that you can't allow yourself to think that you can fight a limited nuclear war of the sort that played out in Carte Blanche and keep it limited. And indeed, there is a serious possibility that if you were in real life to engage in a war in West Germany and the NATO forces and the Soviet forces or the Warsaw Pact forces were to use significant numbers of nuclear weapons, it wasn't clear that you could keep it limited. In fact, there were all sorts of reasons to think it would escalate to a general thermonuclear war, which of course nobody wanted. Anyway, to go back to the 50s, what happens is that in 1957, amazingly, 2 years after Carte Blanche, NATO formalizes a military doctrine. It's called MC 14/2. NATO formalizes a military doctrine which calls for massive use of nuclear weapons to defend Europe and places a great emphasis on using tactical nuclear weapons. That's MC 14/2. And that's approved by NATO in the spring of 1957, 2 years after Carte Blanche. But then what begins to happen over time is that NATO begins to rethink this issue. Given what happened with Carte Blanche, and given all the studies that are subsequently done on the subject of escalation and nuclear flexibility, we begin to realize that a doctrine for defending Europe that relies on tactical nuclear weapons is not a good idea. In fact, it's a very bad idea. So two things happen here. The first is that NATO decides that it's going to emphasize conventional deterrence much more in the future than it had in the past. Remember, I said before that if you're a great power and you're thinking about how to deter an adversary, you have to think about the balance between conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. How much do you want to rely on conventional deterrence? How much do you want to rely on nuclear deterrence? There's no question, given that we live in a nuclear world, that nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence are both going to be present all the time. But the question is, what does the balance look like between the two? And what I'm telling you is that during the 1950, the balance was heavily skewed in favor of nuclear deterrence in Europe. And this, of course, is seen in MC14/2, which is the NATO doctrine that's put into place in the spring of 1957. But what happens over time is that NATO de-emphasizes its reliance on nuclear deterrence, and it begins to build formidable conventional forces, and it begins to rely much more on conventional deterrence. And this is possible in good part because the German army comes online after 1955. Remember, Germany joins NATO in 1955, and Germany rearms in 1955, or it starts rearmament in 1955. This is the same year, same time frame as Carte Blanche. And what happens over the course of the second half of the 1950s and the early 1960s is the Germans develop a very formidable fighting force, conventional fighting force. Remember, the Germans did not have nuclear weapons at the time. The Germans, of course, still have no nuclear weapons. But the Germans had a very formidable conventional army. And the United States commits to building more powerful conventional forces in Europe as well. And we begin to de-emphasize nuclear deterrence, which is another way of saying we begin to de-emphasize our emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons, and we rely much more on conventional deterrence. Now, the second thing that we do is that we fully understand that we want to continue to rely on nuclear deterrence. If conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence fail to stop the Soviets from attacking, and the Soviets attack, we will first.
这一期讨论的并不只是战术核武器该不该使用，更是在追问一个冷酷而现实的问题：当一个国家的常规军力不足以支撑长期战争时，核武器究竟是可靠的安全保障，还是把整个国家推向灾难的危险赌注？从美国冷战时期的战略演变可以看出，核武器从来不是一种可以随意调用的普通武器，它一旦进入战场，改变的就不只是打击范围和杀伤规模，更会改变对手的判断、指挥系统的运行以及整个冲突的心理结构。所谓战术核武器，听起来仿佛只是威力更小、用途更有限的核武器，好像可以被控制在某个战区、某条战线，甚至某几个目标之内。但真正的问题是，核爆炸发生之后，谁能保证对手会按照你的预案行动？谁能保证对方只做出有限回应，而不会认为自己必须全面反击？又有谁能保证通讯、指挥和决策系统在高强度战火与巨大压力下始终保持准确无误？1955年的 Carte Blanche 推演正是对这种幻想的一次沉重打击。在推演设定中，北约与苏联都动用了大量核武器，战场主要位于西德，最终造成数以百万计的人员死亡和受伤，而且这些数字还没有完全计算辐射、疾病、基础设施崩溃以及后续社会失序带来的伤亡。换句话说，原本打着保卫西德旗号的战略，最后却很可能把西德变成无法正常运转的废墟。为了拯救一个国家，先毁掉这个国家，这不是胜利，而是战略目标与作战手段之间最彻底的矛盾。这场推演最重要的启示，不在于某个具体数字，而在于它揭示了核战争的内在逻辑。核武器可以摧毁目标，却很难按照政治家的愿望停在某个范围之内。第一枚核武器被使用之后，对手必然要重新评估你的意图，你是准备到此为止，还是准备继续升级？对手无法确认，就只能为最坏情况做准备。于是，所谓有限打击可能被理解为更大规模攻击的开端，所谓展示决心可能被理解为全面战争已经开始。这就是冲突升级最危险的地方。战术核武器、中程核武器和战略核武器之间表面上存在用途和射程的区别，但在真实危机中，他们背后的政治信号很难被清晰切割。只要核门槛被跨过，双方就会进入一种极度紧张的相互试探，每一次回应都可能被对方认为还不够强硬，每一次加码都可能成为下一轮升级的理由。 最终，决策者面对的就不再是如何赢得战争，而是如何避免战争彻底失控。因此，后来北约战略发生变化，并不是因为核武器突然失去了威力，而是因为人们逐渐承认核武器的威力越大，越难把它当成可控的作战工具。北约开始加强欧洲的常规部队，提升常规威慑能力，同时保留核力量作为最后的战略后盾。核力量不再被放在战场最前沿，而是用于制造一种极端风险，让对手明白继续进攻可能付出无法承受的代价。这种思路的重点不是用核武器打赢一场战争，而是通过有限而明确的威胁，迫使对手停止冒险。这里也体现出一个经常被忽视的事实：真正稳定的威慑不能只建立在核武器之上。一个国家如果常规军力薄弱，军工体系萎缩，弹药储备不足，却试图用核武器弥补所有缺口，最终只会面对更大的风险。因为核武器不能替代工业能力，不能替代后勤体系，不能替代训练有素的部队，也不能替代长期作战所需要的生产和补充能力。常规力量越虚弱，决策者就越容易产生依赖核武器的冲动，而这种依赖越强，核危机就越容易被推到前台。这也是今天重新讨论战术核武器时必须保持警惕的原因。无论战场位于欧洲还是东亚，无论对手是谁，历史经验都告诉我们，不能因为武器体积更小，爆炸当量更低，就误以为它更容易使用，更容易控制，更容易局部化。核武器的危险从来不只是爆炸本身，而是它会迫使双方在极短时间内做出事关国家生存的判断。信息可能不完整，情报可能失真，命令可能被误读，前线行动也可能超出政治领导人的控制。所以这一期内容真正提出的警告是，当常规威慑出现漏洞时，正确的答案不是急于寻找更容易使用的核武器，而是修复常规力量，重建工业基础，恢复长期作战能力，并尽可能让核武器继续停留在最后一道防线的位置。核威慑或许无法被完全排除，但它越靠后越安全，越少被当成战场工具，误判和失控的空间就越小。放眼今天的国际局势，核问题确实正在重新成为全球政治的核心议题。大国竞争加剧，地区冲突延宕，军事同盟不断调整，军工产能与战略储备重新受到重视。在这种环境下，公众更需要区分真正的安全能力与危险的战略幻觉。喊出更强硬的口号，并不等于拥有更可靠的威慑，部署更多武器，也不等于拥有更好的危机管理能力。真正成熟的战略应该既能让对手相信你有决心，也能让对手相信你不会轻易失去控制。看完这一期，你认为核武器的主要作用应该是用于真正作战，还是只应该作为最后的威慑手段？当一个国家常规军力不足时，依靠核力量弥补缺口，究竟是在增强安全，还是在放大风险？欢迎把你的看法留在评论区，也欢迎点赞订阅，继续收看更多精彩视频。